The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom blows Breath of the Wild out of the water. Yep, starting with that. We've all been looking forward to this game ever since a sequel to Breath of the Wild was announced at E3 2019. Nobody knew how long it would take, what it would be like, if it would be too similar, too different, but we all wanted it, and it came. It came slow, for sure, but it came hard. It was difficult, but I found a balance between scarfing the game down and slowing down and taking time to savor the flavor. After almost 2 weeks straight of playing, I've had time to finish everything I wanted in the game, put down the controller, relax, and think about it for a minute. I want to take a second to add that I am not a game critic by any means, just a really big fan of the Zelda franchise who happens to have a small YouTube channel. With that being said, this is everything I have to say about the game. The best and the worst of The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. To give an understandable analysis of Tears of the Kingdom, I first need to talk for a second about Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild was a total game-changing game, totally reshaping the Zelda formula from something pretty linear to completely open in every way. You could do whatever you wanted, and that had its ups and downs. The freedom was next level, being able to shape your own path and story however you wanted to. If you wanted to do something, you could do it. If something piqued your interest, you could make that your next objective, rather than whatever someone else told you to go do. You could play through what most of the game has to offer without even touching the story if you really wanted. And some players loved this. People who were there more for the gameplay could play the game they wanted without cutscenes or mandatory story beats getting in the way. And this freedom made Breath of the Wild a lot of people's favorite game of all time. However, I had been playing Zelda games for a long time and kind of loved them for their linearity. That was just how Zelda games were made, and obviously this was a big change. A change that I did love, don't get me wrong. I put over 100 hours into Breath of the Wild, pretty much completing everything except for the Korok Seeds and Picture Compendium. As a video game, is Breath of the Wild better than Ocarina of Time? Probably, yeah, but as a Zelda game, is it better? I just don't know. Ocarina of Time is one of the most Zelda-y Zelda games with magic gems, key items, dungeons and bosses, and a linear story to follow. Breath of the Wild turns up the freedom and gameplay options to 11, but drops a lot of those classic Zelda things to feel like a completely new game, mostly separate from all other Zelda games before it. With everything practically being optional, it loses a lot of the magic, in my opinion, that made Zelda Zelda. But it's still a fantastic video game. So why am I saying this in a video about Tears of the Kingdom? Well, because I was really nervous it was going to follow too similarly to Breath of the Wild and once again not have as much of that Zelda charm. My worries were for nothing though, because Tears of the Kingdom found the perfect balance between this new open world Zelda and the Zelda games of the past, at least as perfect as possible. I wasn't the only one who had the feelings I just discussed, and Nintendo heard it, I think, and made Tears of the Kingdom the perfect game to mold the two Zelda styles together. Again, perfect as possible. There are still some issues I have that link to Breath of the Wild, but for the most parts, it's improvements across the board. Speaking of improvements, I'm going to start with probably my favorite part of the game, the dungeons. Breath of the Wild had the 4 divine beasts as its main dungeons, and were very similar to one another besides a main gimmick or two. In fact, that was another issue I had with the game. I didn't really enjoy those dungeons. They weren't bad, in fact they had decent puzzles, as Zelda dungeons usually do, but they all had the same vibe and general look to them, and I can't say I can remember any of them in particular off the top of my head even. So going into Tears of the Kingdom, I was really nervous that it would have a similar problem. However, once I got to the Stormwind arc, I knew I had no reason to worry anymore. The dungeons in this game were total spectacles. The game makes getting into the temples its own trial and teaches you how to use your new partners. For the Stormwind arc, still such a cool name, you team up with Tolan and he grants you an ability to ride the wind forward. You've got to use this ability as well as bouncy flying Viking ships, oh my god this game is so cool, to get up to the Wind Temple, which is the Stormwind arc. That whole process is an ordeal in itself, but the trials at the temple don't even start until you get up there. Once you get to the temple, you've got to figure out how to open 5 locks to open up a central door. The puzzles are fun and take a little thinking to complete, but you'll get them eventually. And once you get all 5, the central door will open and Colgera, the Scourge of the Wind Temple, will emerge. And oh man, when I say this thing was terrifying and so epic to fight, it was dope as shit. It was probably my favorite part of my entire playthrough, and I'm not even joking. This whole temple sequence was fantastic, actually, and some of the most fun I've had in any game in a while. Once you beat the boss, Toland becomes the Sage of Wind, who will help you in your adventure and let you use that flying power for the rest of the game. This was the part where I kind of connected the dots and realized I would have to go to every region, complete a temple, and get the Sage's power. So I did this. I went to Goron City next, where I found Yunobo corrupted by the gloomified rock, which was a really fun twist. Riding up the mountain in the minecart was also really fun. Again, it is a precursor challenge to the temple, which allows you to get the hang of using your partner Yunobo to help you. His ability is to launch himself and impact with a fiery explosion. Getting to the top is where the real fun begins though. The mountain explodes and 3 heads emerge. What follows is a sky battle, using Yunobo to blast the heads away. After all of this, you still have to dive into the heart of the volcano, where at the bottom you can find the Fire Temple. The Fire Temple builds on what you just learned about Yunobo and minecarts and uses that as the basis of its puzzles. This temple is ginormous, and you need to traverse it with minecarts to unlock 5 locks, similar to the last dungeon. At least, that's what you're supposed to do. With Link's ability to climb basically everything, I was able to make it through this temple using probably less than half of the minecarts I was supposed to. This is both a good and bad thing. An old Zelda game would have made you figure out the minecart puzzles that were intended. However, because I sometimes didn't feel like doing that, I could create my own puzzles and see how I could get from point A to point B using my climbing and some creativity. It wasn't what was intended, but was almost more rewarding as I figured out how to get where I wanted to go using my own methods. Anyway, once you do this, you're able to fight the boss, which is a variation of the classic Goma, which is just awesome. Beating Goma will play a cutscene that allows Yunobo to become the Sage of Fire, almost the exact same cutscene that played when we did the same with Toland, but at this point, I didn't really notice that yet. The next temple I tackled was the Water Temple, which has you team up with Sidon, ascend up some platforms with low gravity jumping while learning how to use his water power. Getting to the temple, having to go around and unlock 4 water faucets, fighting the boss using Sidon's power, and watching a cutscene where Sidon becomes the Sage of Water. Okay, whatever. Next, the Lightning Temple sequence has you defend Gerudo Town while learning to use Riju's lightning ability. Okay, this was actually pretty dang fun. And then you make your way to the Lightning Temple, and then you go inside and use Light and Mirrors to unlock 4 locks. Then fight the boss using your new lightning power and watch the same cutscene you've seen 3 times now, where Riju becomes the Sage of Lightning and says almost identical words as the last 3 characters you did this with. Okay. So this isn't that big of a deal, and I realize why they did it, but it's just a tad annoying. Each of the dungeons on their own is really fun. They have good build-ups, good uses of mechanics, unique designs, fun and epic boss fights, but after you get to your 3rd and 4th one, you realize that they all share kind of the same general principle and way of progression. And again, the cutscene that plays is nearly identical, just with different characters. I get why they did this. They had to make it so that you can start wherever and have it be an acceptable difficulty for that point in the game. They can't make the last dungeon the hardest because there really is no last dungeon, and due to the nature of the game, they can't make linear dungeons where you go from beginning to end. It would take away from all the freedom you normally have. The temples are like condensed versions of the entire game. You can complete whichever of the 4 or 5 tasks in whatever order you want to. While this creates fun individual dungeons, looking at them all together makes them feel relatively similar in design. Despite this though, I still love all the dungeons in this game because though they had you doing similar things when broken down, the methods of getting to those things were completely different from dungeon to dungeon. And to touch on the bosses quick too, fighting organic beasts that varied wildly rather than 4 bosses that were virtually the same, those being the Blight Ganons, created even more variety between them and recaptured some of the Zelda magic that was lost in Breath of the Wild. Like I said, the dungeons and bosses were my favorite part of the entire game, so don't take my criticisms too negatively. Taking a step back now though, I wanted to touch on Link's new abilities because these abilities facilitate the way that the entire game is played. After losing his arm trying to save Zelda, Link is given a new one by the first king of Hyrule, Rauru. This arm gives him the abilities Ultra Hand, Fuse, Ascend, Recall, and eventually Auto Build. Ultra Hand is kind of what I would call the game's main ability. It allows you to move almost anything in the game and attach it to almost anything else in the game. This feature allows endless possibilities of things for players to build and opens the door for countless ways of playing the game. A lot of the puzzles are based around the ability to move and stick things together, and I would say the game utilizes this ability to its full potential, or at least very close to it. Auto Build is a sort of optional power that you can find that allows the player to automatically build things that they either have the schematics for or things that they've built in the past. A power that's admittedly very useful, but I will say I don't think I used it even once. I pretty much just always forgot about it. Fuse is another important ability. Due to the gloom that plagues Hyrule, most of the weapons you find are decayed and don't do much damage. To get stronger weapons, for the most part at least, you need to fuse different things like monster horns to your weapons to make them stronger. You can also fuse things to arrows and shields to make them stronger as well. Next, I'll bring up Recall, which is probably the coolest ability, at least on paper. It reverses time for any moving object you use it on, and its best use is probably for reversing a falling rock to ascend back into the sky. Speaking of ascend, probably the most slept on ability, but honestly my favorite. If you're underneath something or underground, ascend basically just lets you swim through the ground and up onto the top of whatever you were under. It's very much a power that has one specific use, but I honestly loved how much it helped me traverse the world. All of these powers are what separate Tears of the Kingdom from Breath of the Wild, except for one, teeny tiny small thing. The Sky Islands. At the very beginning of marketing, the Sky Islands were Tears of the Kingdom's big selling point and seemed like they were going to be the big new thing of this game. And they were, but also weren't. See, the game has you start out on a sky island, a really big sky island that acts as this game's great plateau, learning the ropes on your new hand abilities. This island is super promising, but once you leave and explore the rest of the sky islands, there isn't as much to them as you'd expect. There's an archipelago of islands in each region of the game. However, most of these aren't very big, and surprisingly, the tutorial island actually ends up being the biggest sky island in the game. Also, while we're on the topic, nothing huge, but I'm a little sad there's no Skyloft references here, unless I missed one. I mean, let me know, but I don't think there are any. Anyway, so yeah, I'm very surprised. I probably spent the least of my time in the sky out of the big 3 areas of the map. Speaking of, the depths, yeah, I was not expecting this one, whatsoever. I honestly did think it would be cool if Tears of the Kingdom had an underground world after playing through Elden Ring, but I never thought they would actually do it. But then they did. It was like a prediction, but not really, because I didn't think it would happen, so yeah. The depths span like the entire map of Hyrule, just underground, and house a lot of ancient Zonai ruins that let you learn about the lore and whatnot. It's also the main setting of the Yiga clan's return. You can find Koga down here and fight him in some really unique boss battles. I'll definitely have to rank the boss battles at some point. Let me know if you want to see that. The main takeaway of the depths, though, for me is actually all of the legacy armor. I am a sucker for all of the old school Link costumes, and you already know I wore the Wind Waker armor for the entire rest of the game once I found it. I clapped Ganondorf's cheeks up, down, and sideways in the Wind Waker armor. Honestly, my favorite area though of the game was just Hyrule again. It was completely redone and felt like a brand new place rather than traversing Breath of the Wild's Hyrule a second time. I don't know if that's because I haven't played Breath of the Wild since it got DLC, or if it's really that different, but either way, it really worked for me. I will say, I definitely didn't do as much plain exploring as I did in Breath of the Wild in this game, just because there's 3 different planes. I love Zelda so much, but I just cannot fully explore all 3 big areas, the sky, the depths, and Hyrule. It's too much for me. I didn't get every shrine or light route, just the ones I found pretty easily. Obviously, I didn't get every Korok seed, not even close. I did get every tower and tier to fill out the map and watch all the cutscenes though, so I did do some decent exploring, just not every nook and cranny like I kinda did in Breath of the Wild. Speaking of shrines, this actually kind of leads leads me into my least favorite part about Tears of the Kingdom, the shrines. A lot of the shrines that I did were actually pretty fun. They used the new game mechanics to their full potential and had some real head-scratching puzzles in there. However, I have no interest in completing them all, and this is because I get bored of looking at them. Breath of the Wild did something I wasn't really a fan of, see. It took the medieval feel of Zelda and made a bunch of robots and technology. This wasn't my favorite change, but it was fine. Tears of the Kingdom did help with this. The boss fights were against beasts instead of robot creatures. The dungeons felt old and archaic rather than old sci-fi. But the Zonai shrines don't fit that vibe at all. They have the same blocky, cubed, artificial look of the Sheikah shrines, just with a green tint rather than a blue one. And I know that sounds picky, and it kind of is, because this is a great game, but it makes me feel like I'm doing the Sheikah shrines all over again. And I did like over 120 of those with the DLC. I did not feel like doing more. I had to, for heart pieces and stamina, and a lot of puzzles were admittedly fun, but the aesthetic just bored me to death. I really did not want to enter any shrines I found. Towards the end of the game, I was only going into them to create fast travel points rather than actually complete them. Korok seeds are kind of in the same boat, but they take up so little time that I didn't feel as strongly about them, so they're fine. Anyways, that was my rant. Thanks for listening. Side quests, on the other hand, came back better than ever. There are a lot of great ones, but some that I liked the best were the whole Hateno fiasco with the farmers versus fashionistas, the Great Fairy quest getting the band back together and activating the Great Fairies, the stable quests alongside Pen Narito and the news people, the Lorelin Village quest, fighting off all the pirates and rebuilding the town, and the quest where you have to take pictures of different monsters and put them in a diorama in Terrytown. That was really fun. Going from side quests to main quests, the last big thing I wanted to talk about was the story. I know I spoiled like pretty much all of the big things that the game has to offer, but I won't go in depth and literally spell out the story. I'll let you guys play it yourselves. But I will say that this Zelda story was one like no other. It had so much new, but also referenced so much old. This was something that Breath of the Wild did well too, but honestly, Tears of the Kingdom does it so much better. Speaking of Breath of the Wild, to contrast it, that game had a very passive story, where it was all basically told in memories. Tears of the Kingdom has that same mechanic where you can kind of find cutscenes in certain places, but the story in each of the regions happens very actively and is really fun to play through. Everything with Zelda is very poignant, and I had genuinely worried for her safety toward the end. Actually, I changed my mind. If you don't want end of game story spoilers, leave now. I'll give you 3, 2, 1. I thought Zelda was going to be stuck as a dragon. I didn't think for a second that we could use recall to bring Zelda back. I thought this was going to be a Zelda game with a really sad ending. No saved Zelda in the end. The sadness of seeing Zelda as this dragon, but also the epicness of her and all of your other allies helping at the very end of the game was quite the ending to such a great game. I know this game and its prequel are made to be games that you can do whatever you want, but please, please, please see the story through. I promise it's worth it. A few final small things I wanted to touch on. The enemies and bosses were so fun and had such great variety. For enemies, I really like the Horriblins and that the Gibdos are native only to the desert. And for bosses, adding in Gleeok was such a good call, and my fight against a King Gleeok ended up being so epic, I wish I had it recorded. I also really like the Monster Forces fights, which are a bunch of monsters in an area that have a combined boss health bar. I thought those were really cool. In terms of performance, sound design, all that stuff, really great work by the Zelda team. The music is good as ever, and the game looks just as good, if not better, than Breath of the Wild. In terms of performance, even with the map being so much bigger than Breath of the Wild's, I feel like it almost performed better than that game. I probably only had my frame rate drop like once or twice, and I remember it happening all the time in Breath of the Wild, so that was really awesome. There's a ton more I could say, but I think I'll leave it at that. So with all that being said, Tears of the Kingdom definitely has its flaws, and they stem from that openness it has and from being a sequel to Breath of the Wild. The flaws it has, though, are honestly really small things and not objective at all. So looking past them, I can confidently say this sequel was very much worth the wait and is one of the greatest games of all time. Breath of the Wild changed the video game industry, and so Tears of the Kingdom had quite the shoes to fill, but somehow it managed to do it. Very happy with this game, and hope you all are too. Let me know your favorite and least favorite parts of Tears of the Kingdom in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next one. Mwah. Bye-bye.